On a cold Saturday morning in November of 1947, in the foreclosure yard behind the Polk County Fairgrounds in Iowa, a 14-year-old girl named Della Keller raised a wooden paddle that nobody in that crowd believed belonged in her hand. She was small for her age, thin in the way that comes from too many winters and not enough kitchens swallowed inside a brown wool coat 2 sizes too big, a coat that had belonged to a man now dead. On her hands, she wore her grandfather's leather work gloves cracked and oiled dark, and they ran nearly to her elbows. Her hair was pulled back under a gray knit cap that left only the pale oval of her face showing in the morning light. She held the paddle the way a child holds something far too heavy with both hands lifted to the height of her chest. And she held it steady because she had practiced being steady in the dark of her room until her arms shook, and the shaking stopped, and a kind of stillness took its place that no 14-year-old should have had to learn. If you have ever stood quiet in a loud room knowing something, the loud people do not, then stay with me through this one. This story is for you, and it does not go where the first 30 seconds make you think it goes. Tell me in the comments where in this country you are watching from, because I read every single one, and the people in this story would have wanted you to know they were not forgotten. The lot was number 23, a rusted Waterloo Boy Model N tractor from the year 1918 sitting at the very back of the equipment line on 2 flat tires with no battery in it, and a seat split down the middle from 30 years of weather. It should never have been left out in. Faded green paint streaked here and there with rust, the color of dried blood. The steering wheel gone gray, where 10,000 mornings of a man's hands had worn the finish away. It was the kind of machine every man in that yard had walked past without slowing his stride. The kind of thing a buyer looks at once and dismisses a heap of dead iron. A scrap man might take off your hands if you were willing to throw in $1 for the trouble. The auctioneer had announced the opening bid at $200 in the bored flat voice he saved for items he did not expect to sell. He had a long line of equipment to move that morning: plows and harrows and a good farm awl and a hay rake worth real money and lot. 23 was a thing to get past, not a thing to dwell on. Della had $340 folded in the inside pocket of that wool coat. She had counted it 3 times the night before, sitting cross-legged on the floor of a borrowed bedroom under a dead boy's photographs, not because she was afraid it would be short. She knew to the penny how much was there. She counted it because it was the only thing left in the entire world that was hers, and a person holds tight to the one thing they have left, and counting it was a way of holding it. A fertilizer man near the front laughed first. His name was Clint Slater, and he had a laugh like a dog's bark, short and sharp and built to carry to the back rows. $200 for that pile of scrap, Slater said. You would be paying a man to haul it off your property. A few of the men near him grinned. The auctioneer, a heavy fellow in a sheepskin coat, with a face the weather had been working on for 60 years, dropped the price to $100 to get it moving. Silence. A few men spat tobacco onto the frozen dirt and looked at their boots and waited for the lot to die so the real selling could continue. And from the back of the crowd, a small voice carried clear across the cold, steady and high and unafraid. $100. Heads turned, necks craned. Men shifted on the rough wooden bleachers to see around the shoulders of the men in front of them. And there she stood, 14 years old, her grandfather's gloves nearly swallowing her wrists, her face the pale of a girl who had not slept her chin level, and her eyes fixed on the auctioneer's stand, and on nothing else because she had been told 100 times by the only man who ever raised her that when you have decided to do a hard thing, you do not look around the room to see who is watching you. You look at the thing and you do it. The laughter began with Slater and it spread the way. Laughter spreads through a crowd of men who do not want to be the only one not laughing. It moved through the front rows and up into the bleachers until half the yard was openly grinning at the child with the paddle. Some of them slapped a knee. One old boy in the second row laughed so hard he had to take off his hat and wipe his eyes with the back of his wrist. It was not cruel laughter, most of it. It was the easy laughter of working men at the strange sight of a little girl bidding on a wreck. The kind of thing that would be a story at supper, the day a kid tried to buy a tractor. They did not know yet that they were laughing inside a church without knowing it was a church. The auctioneer leaned over his stand and looked down at her, and his voice when it came was not unkind. "Young lady," he said, "are your folks here with you this morning? My grandfather raised me." Della answered, "He passed last year." "I am here on my own, sweetheart," the auctioneer said. "This is a working auction. A child cannot bid on equipment without a guardian standing beside her. There are rules." She did not lower the paddle. Her arms had begun to burn from holding it at her chest. But she did not lower it by a single inch. "I am 14, she said. "Iowa law says 14 is old enough to make a contract for personal property if I can prove the money. The money is in my pocket. It is cash." I counted it. That answer landed strange in the yard. A few of the grins flickered out. A man does not expect a child to know the law better than he does. And the ones nearest the front who had been grinning hardest found themselves looking down at their boots. Because there is something in a working man that goes quiet when he is shown up by a kid who did her homework. The laughter thinned to a few scattered chuckles, and then to nothing at all. But Clint Slater was not the kind to look down at anything. Hollis, he called out to the auctioneer loud enough for the whole yard. "This is a circus. Get her out of the ring so the rest of us can do real business." Some of us did not drive 40 miles in the cold to watch a little girl play farmer, and there was a thing in his voice that did not match the moment. A thing that the rest of the men were too busy being amused to hear. But the girl heard it. The other men laughed because the sight was odd. A small thing dressed in a big coat, reaching for something far too large for her. Slater was not laughing because it was odd. There was a hard edge under his words, a private kind of heat. The heat of a man who hated something that had nothing to do with a rusted tractor at all. The girl felt it before she understood it. She had grown up reading the faces of grown men around a supper table, where one quiet man had taught her without ever meaning to, that what a person says and what a person feels are very often two different countries. She knew the difference between a man laughing at a child and a man hating the dead. And she filed it away the way she filed everything. And she kept her paddle up to understand why a 14-year-old orphan stood her ground in a yard full of laughing men. That morning, you have to understand what she had walked away from to get there, and what she had carried into that yard, folded in a coat pocket and saved 1/4 at a time, across the longest year of her short life. Della Keller had lost her family twice. Her father, Levi Keller, and her mother were killed when a truck slid through a county intersection on a sheet of black ice in the winter of 1935. Della was 2 years old at the time. She did not remember them. She had one photograph, a young man with her grandfather's jaw, standing beside a woman who was laughing into the wind so hard that her hair had come loose across her face, and out of that single frozen second, Della had built an entire mother and an entire father, a whole pair of people who had never been allowed to grow real. She kept the photograph in the lining of her coat. She kept everything that mattered close to her body, where it could not be taken. After the accident, her grandparents took her in. Walter Keller and his wife Pearl raised her on 320 acres of black Iowa dirt in the northeast corner of Polk County. They were old to be raising a small child, and they did it anyway without complaint, the way Walter Keller did most hard things, with his sleeves rolled and his mouth shut. He was not a warm man on the surface of him. He did not say the soft things. But Della grew up understanding that there are men whose love does not come out of their mouth. It comes out of their hands. And Walter's came out of his every single day. He fixed the loose board on her side of the wagon before she knew it was loose. He left the lamp burning low in the hall when she was small and afraid of the dark. And he never once mentioned it, and she never once thanked him. And that was the whole and perfect agreement between them. He taught her things a granddaughter is not usually taught. He taught her how an engine breathes, how to tell by ear when a motor is starving for fuel, and when it is drowning in too much, how to read the weather off the way the cattle stood. He taught her that you do not lend a man money you cannot afford to lose, and you do not say a thing you are not ready to stand behind, and you do not begin a hard job unless you have already decided how you will finish it. He taught her the law of his own life in scraps and pieces over a decade of suppers, and she absorbed it the way a field absorbs rain, slow and total, and without seeming to try. Pearl died of pneumonia in the winter of 1945, when Della was 12 in a back bedroom with the radio playing low, and the two of them, the old man and the girl, sitting on either side of the bed, holding the dying woman's two hands. Walter did not cry where Della could see. He cried in the barn, she knew, because she heard him once through the wall of the milking parlor. A sound she had never heard a grown man make, and she had backed away from the door and never told a soul. Because she understood even at 12 that some doors a person is not meant to open. And Walter, who had buried a son and now a wife and never once let a neighbor see him bend, lasted 11 more months before his heart stopped him in the milking barn on a March morning in 1946. He was 68 years old. Della found him. She was 13. She had come out to the barn before dawn because the cows had not been let out, and she knew without being told what that meant, because the cows being unled at that hour was the one thing on that farm Walter Keller would never have allowed while he drew breath. She found him sitting against the stanchion with the milking stool tipped over beside him, and his hat fallen into the gutter, and his face was peaceful, and his hands, those hands that had done all his loving for him, were folded loose in his lap, as if he had only sat down to rest. She did not scream. She sat down beside him in the cold and put her head against his shoulder for a while. And then she got up and let the cows out, because that was what he would have wanted done first. And then she walked the half mile to the neighbors to use their telephone. The farm went into probate within the week. There was a small note against the place. Walter had borrowed against the well 2 years earlier to replace a pump. The kind of loan a man pays off in a season and thinks nothing of. And he had nearly paid it off, and another good harvest would have closed it out entirely. But a dead man cannot make a payment, and there was no living adult to take the debt. And so the machinery of the bank began to turn, the way that machinery turns, slow and patient and without malice and without mercy, grinding the works of one quiet man's life into paper and signatures and lots to be sold. The man who turned it was named Dennis Roth. He was the loan officer who pushed the foreclosure through. He did not do it cruelly. He did it the way a man stamps a form, with a kind of careful blankness, the same blankness on every face, no face at all. He sat behind a desk in the county office while the adults decided what would happen to the only home a 13-year-old girl had ever known. And Della sat in a hard chair in the corner of that room with her hands folded in her lap, exactly the way her grandfather's hands had been folded in the barn. And Dennis Roth never once looked her in the eye. Not once. He looked at the papers, and he looked at the other men, and he looked at the window, and he did not look at the girl. And years later, that not looking would turn out to matter more than anyone in that room could ever have guessed. But on the day they sold the Keller land out from under her, Dennis Roth was only a quiet man in a gray suit who signed where the lines told him to sign. The land was sold. The house was emptied. The furniture went to auction and the dishes went to auction, and the photographs that were not nailed to Della's body went into a box that went somewhere she was never told. And Della, 13 years old and an orphan twice over, was placed with the only blood relation the county could find. A widow named Mabel Carver, 71 years old, who lived in a small clapboard house on the edge of the town of Mitchellville on a pension that had been cut thin enough for one. Mabel was kind. That has to be said first, and said plainly, because of what comes later, and because the kindness was real. But she was also tired in a way that went past her bones and into something underneath them. She had buried a husband in 1938 and a son in a war before that. And the small back bedroom she gave the girl had been the boys' room once, still papered in the faded blue of a boy's choosing, still hung with the photographs of a young man in a uniform who smiled out at the ceiling above a bed that had not held a sleeper in years. Della slept under the gaze of a stranger she had never met, in the bed of a dead boy, in a house that smelled of an old woman's grief, and at night when the house had gone still and the furnace had ticked down to cold, she cried into a pillow that had been bought for a different child entirely, and she made certain every single night that Mabel never heard a sound. For 3 months, Della was a ghost in that house. She walked to school. She did her arithmetic, which she was good at, and her reading, which she was better at. She dried the dishes. Mabel washed the two of them at the sink in a silence that was not unkind, but was not company either. She did not cry where anyone could see, and she did not speak of her grandfather, and she did not unpack the small box of things she had been allowed to keep, because to unpack it would be to admit that this borrowed room was a place she lived now, and she was not ready to admit that, and a part of her never would be. And then in February of 1947, she read a paragraph in the Polk County paper that changed the entire shape of her grief. It was an announcement 3 column inches buried in the legal notices between a tax sale and a notice of intent to drain a slough. The foreclosure auction of the Walter Keller estate had been scheduled for November the 14th. There was a list of the items to be sold: 3 tractors, a list of implements, and one of the tractors was described in the flat language of the law as a Waterloo Boy year 1918 serial number, partly worn away. Della read it standing up in the kitchen, and she had to sit down at the table, and she read it again. And then she went and got Mabel's sewing scissors out of the basket, and she cut the paragraph out careful and square the way her grandfather cut everything straight along the line. She folded it once and folded it again, and she slid it under her mattress, and she made a decision in the quiet of her own chest that she told to no living soul. That tractor was not scrap. That tractor was the one thing in the entire estate that no investor wanted and no bank could love. The land would go to men in suits. The good farmall would go to a real farmer who would put it to real work. The dishes were already gone, but that 1918 Waterloo Boy on 2 flat tires with the split seat and the worn wheel, the one machine her grandfather had ever told her he loved, that one was small enough and broken enough and worthless enough that maybe, just maybe, a girl with a cookie tin could reach it. And she was going to bring it home. She began to babysit. 3 afternoons a week and most Saturday evenings, she minded the children of women in Mitchellville for 75 cents an hour. She watched the Hadley baby while its mother took in sewing across town, a fat, patient infant that slept through everything and woke to laugh at the ceiling. She watched the 2 Reardon boys who were a holy terror and required her to be 3 places at once. and who liked her because she did not lie to them and did not threaten them and simply outlasted them, the way her grandfather had taught her to outlast a stubborn engine by being patient longer than the trouble could keep itself up. She read to a sick old woman 2 doors down for a quarter an evening, the same Western novel over and over, because it was the only book in the house, and the old woman could not remember from one night to the next how it ended. She kept every cent she earned in a metal cookie tin in the back of her closet, pushed in behind the dead boy's old shoes that Mabel had never been able to bring herself to throw away. She did it for 37 straight weeks. She did it through the gray slush of spring and the long green choking heat of an Iowa summer, and into the first cold snap of fall. And every Sunday night she emptied the tin onto the floor and counted it, and wrote the total on the back of the cutout paragraph in a column of small, careful numbers, and watched the column climb week by week, quarter by quarter, toward a number she could not be sure would be enough. And there was one more thing she did in those months that nobody knew about, and that turned out to matter more than the money. 3 afternoons a week after she had minded whatever children needed minding, she walked to the little public library on the corner of Main and 2nd, and she sat in the back at a long oak table with a green-shaded lamp, and she read the law. She had heard the men say it could not be done. A child cannot bid, a child cannot own. And she had decided that before she would believe a grown man telling her what she could not do, she would go and read the thing for herself and find out. She found the Iowa Code in 3 fat green volumes on a low shelf, and she read the parts about contracts and the parts about the age of capacity slowly, with a dictionary open beside her, and she learned that a minor over 14 could indeed bind himself to a contract for personal property if he could demonstrate the means to perform it. She wrote that down. And then, because she was Walter Keller's granddaughter, and Walter Keller never began a job, without deciding how it would finish, she kept reading. She read the parts about real property and the parts about fixtures, the parts that nobody had told her she would need, and she did not yet know why she was reading them, only that a thing that could be lost on a technicality should be defended against the technicality before it ever arose. She read it twice. She did not know, sitting at that green lamp, that the reading would save her tractor a second time hours after she had won it. But she read it twice all the same, because half measures were a thing her grandfather had no patience for, living or dead. She found out about the cookie tin 3 days before the auction, when she finally told Mabel. Mabel set down the dish she was drying. She set it down slowly, the way a person sets something down when their hands have begun to shake, and she turned around in that small kitchen with the steam still rising off the sink and the dish towel hanging forgotten in her 2 hands. "You want to spend every dollar you have saved, Mabel," said her voice gone low, "on a broken machine you cannot drive, that you have no place to keep, to bring back a piece of a life that is gone." "Yes," Della said. "Child." Mabel's eyes had gone bright and hard at the same time, which is a thing eyes can only do when there is love and fear braided up together behind them. "I have watched you cry through that wall for 9 months, thinking I could not hear you. I have heard every night of it, and I have let you cry, and I have not come in, because grief is a thing a person has to walk through on their own 2 feet, and there is no walking it for them. God knows I have tried to walk it for people, and you cannot. But this is not walking through it. This is going back to the grave you have nearly climbed out of and digging it open again with your bare hands and lying back down inside it." "It is not," Della said. "It is," Mabel said. And now her voice cracked clean across the middle, "because I have done it. I went and dug for my boy for years after they brought him home in a box that they would not even let me open. I built my whole life around a hole in the ground. And I will tell you what I found every time at the bottom of all that digging. More dirt. Just more dirt. You are 14 years old. You have a whole life standing in front of you waiting for you to come and live it. Do not spend it underground with the dead. Let the land go. Let the iron go. Let your grandfather rest and let yourself live. Because that is the only thing he ever wanted for you. I promise you that it is the only thing any of them ever want. I am not trying to bring him back, Della said, and her own voice was steady in a way that frightened the old woman far more than tears would have, because tears she would have known how to answer. I know he is not coming back. I held him in the barn before anybody else came. I sat with him a while. I know exactly what gone feels like, Mabel. I know it better than I know anything. I'm not trying to bring him back. I am trying to keep the one thing of his that no one else in this whole county wants. That is all. One tractor. One. And if I do not stand up for it, it goes to a scrap man with a torch who will not even know what it is. He is melting down, and there will be nothing left of my grandfather anywhere in the world except a name on a stone. And I cannot let that happen. While I have money in a tin and 2 feet to carry me to the auction. Mabel did not answer for a long moment. The clock on the wall ticked. Outside, a dog barked twice and gave it up. And then she said the thing that would sit in Della's chest for years afterward, because she said it not in anger, but in the flat, scoured exhaustion of a woman who has run all the way to the end of her arguments and found the road still going. I will not take you, Mabel said. I will not give you bus fare. If you go to that auction, you go against me. And when you are standing in that yard all alone with 200 strange men, you remember that an old woman who has come to love you told you with her whole heart to stay home. Della went anyway. On the morning of the 14th, she told Mabel she was joining a friend's family for a day in the country. The lie sat ugly in her mouth, and she carried it out the door like a stone. Mabel, distracted by a hot water heater that had quit in the night and left her with cold dishwater, and a temper did not question it, only waved her off with a tired hand and went back to the pilot light. She was trying to coax back to life. Della walked the 4 blocks to the bus station in the gray cold. She paid $1.45 from a separate fold of money she had set aside weeks before for exactly this purpose, because she had planned the bus fare the way she had planned everything down to the penny, kept apart from the tractor money, so that not 1 cent meant for the Waterloo Boy would ever be spent on getting to it. And she rode the rural line out to the fairgrounds with her grandfather's gloves on her lap and the emptied cookie tin's contents folded flat against her ribs. The bus let her out at the fairgrounds gate. She walked across the frozen mud to the registration table set up under a canvas awning, and she filled out the bidder card with her own name, Della Keller. She printed it carefully in block letters so there would be no mistake the way her grandfather had taught her to print anything that mattered, every letter standing up straight on its own. The clerk who took the card was a young woman named Nora Vaughn, no more than 25, with a pencil tucked behind her ear and a ledger open in front of her and a wool muffler wound twice around her throat against the cold. She read the name on the card, and her pencil stopped moving. She looked up at the thin girl in the enormous coat, and she looked back down at the card, and she opened her mouth as if to say something. And then she closed it again slowly, and she looked back down at the ledger. And her hand, when she copied the name into the open book, was not quite steady. She did not ask the girl any questions. She wrote the name, and she wrote beneath it what the girl told her granddaughter of Walter Keller of the Keller farm. And she handed across a wooden paddle with a number on it. And she watched the girl walk away into the yard with an expression on her young face that Della was far too nervous to read. It was not pity, and it was not amusement. It was something closer to the held breath of a person who has just seen written down in front of them a name they were not expecting to ever see again. A name out of a story they were raised on. Because Nora Vaughn knew the name Keller. Her own father had told her about a man named Walter Keller more times than she could count. On more cold winter nights than she wanted to remember, sitting by the stove with his bad leg propped up. And she had grown up on that story the way other children grow up on scripture, knowing the words before she understood them. But that is the second story, and we are not quite there yet. So now Della stood in the yard with her paddle raised to her chest, and Clint Slater was calling her a circus, and the auctioneer was leaning over his stand trying to decide what in the world to do with a child who had just quoted Iowa property law back at him in front of 200 men. And somewhere near the chain-link fence at the rim of the yard, a quiet man in a gray overcoat had stopped walking and gone very still. Dennis Roth had not planned to come to this auction. He had told himself, in fact, several different things across the morning that he had business at the courthouse, that the fairgrounds happened to lie on his way, that a man likes to keep an eye on the disposition of estates he has handled. None of it was true. He had stamped the foreclosure on the Keller place a year before, and it had stuck under his fingernail like a splinter he could not work loose. And on this cold morning, his feet had carried him to the back of this yard without ever consulting the rest of him. He stood at the fence now with his hands jammed in his pockets, and he watched the small girl hold up her paddle against a laughing crowd. And a feeling he had no name for, a feeling he had spent years learning not to have, began to climb up the inside of his ribs, like cold water filling a well. He too knew the name Keller. He had known it long before he ever stamped it onto a form. He had simply spent a great deal of careful effort across a great many years arranging not to remember why. But that is part of the third story, and we are not there yet either. Back at the stand, the auctioneer had still not answered Clint Slater, and Slater took the silence as a kind of permission, and he pressed. "Hollis," he said, "you know me. You have known my family 30 years and more, and I am telling you that name on her card is not a name that ought to be getting any special handling in this county. The Kellers were not the saints folks like to make them. You let her play her little game here, and you are spitting on more history than you have any idea of." That landed wrong in the yard. The men who had been grinning a minute before went quiet, not because they understood what Slater meant, but precisely because they did not. A child bidding on a wreck was a thing a crowd of men could laugh at together. A grown man standing up to hiss about old grudges over the head of an orphan girl in oversized gloves was a different kind of thing, entirely a colder thing, an ugly thing. And it made even the men who had laughed loudest shift their weight on the planks and find somewhere else to look. Della turned her head and looked at Clint Slater for the first time. Really looked at him the way her grandfather had taught her to look at a man before she decided what he was. And she said, in a voice that was quiet, but somehow reached every corner of that cold yard, "You knew my grandfather." It was not a question, and Slater knew it was not. His jaw worked. Something moved across his face that was not anger, that was older and uglier than anger, the particular look of a man who has just been handed back a piece of his own past that he had paid good money over many years to bury. Everyone in this county knew Walter Keller, he said, and the way he said the name, the way he had to push it out past his teeth, was the way a man says the name of a thing that owns him and that he cannot stand to owe. The auctioneer had gone very still behind his stand. His name was Clayton Briggs, and he had called auctions at the Polk County Fairgrounds for 31 years. He was 64 years old. He had been born and raised in the northeast corner of the county on the same hard black ground the Kellers had farmed. And he was a man who had spent 3 decades training his face to show nothing at all, because an auctioneer who lets the crowd read his feelings is an auctioneer who loses money for the people who hired him. And a man who loses money for the people who hired him does not call auctions for 31 years. He had been only half listening to Slater, his mind already moving ahead to the good farmall in Lot 26. He had heard the word Keller, and he had heard the girl say, "My grandfather raised me," and somewhere far back in his mind, a heavy door had begun very slowly on long unused hinges to swing open. But Clayton Briggs was a careful man, and in his half-listening he had not yet done the one thing he did at every sale he had ever called the one small act that came before the gavel, and before the money, and before everything else. The act that 31 years had worn into him so deep, it was no longer even a thought. He had not yet read the bidder card. It was sitting on the stand in front of him where the clerk had passed it up. He had glanced at it the way a man glances at a thing he does not expect to need. He had not read it. And now, with the yard gone strange and quiet around him, and the fertilizer man hissing about old history and a 14-year-old girl staring down a grown man twice her size without dropping her eyes, Clayton Briggs picked up the card and brought it close to his face and read the name printed there in careful, upright block letters, Della Keller. And beneath it in the line the clerk filled in for a state of origin in Nora Vaughn's not quite steady hand were the words, "Granddaughter of Walter Keller, of the Keller Farm, Polk County." Clayton Briggs read it once. Then he read it again, slower, as if the second reading might change the first. And the careful, trained 31-year stillness went out of his face all at once, the way the surface of a pond goes when something heavy drops into it, from a height the calm shattering outward in rings. He set the card down on the stand. He took off his glasses, and in front of 200 men who had come to do business and to laugh at a child, Clayton Briggs, who had not shown a single feeling in that yard in 31 years of calling its auctions, pressed the heel of one hand hard against his eyes and wept. The yard did not understand, but the yard knew. There is a thing a crowd of working men understands long before it understands anything else. A thing older than reason, and it is the sight of a hard man breaking. The grins were entirely gone now. The whole yard had gone the kind of quiet where you can hear the wind moving through the chain link and the cattle lowing in the far pens, and a single crow somewhere up in the bare trees. 200 men leaned forward without meaning to, without knowing they were doing it. Clint Slater took a half step back. "Hollis," he said, and the edge had gone out of his voice and left something thinner behind. "Hollis, what is the matter with you?" Briggs put his glasses back on. His hands were not steady, and he did not try to hide that they were not. He looked down at the girl in the brown wool coat, with her grandfather's gloves, swallowing her thin wrists. And when he spoke again, his voice was low, so low, that every man in that yard had to stop his own breathing in order to hear it. "Young lady," he said, "what was your grandfather's full name?" "Walter," she said. "Walter Keller." And the tractor, Briggs said, "The one in Lot 23. Did your grandfather ever tell you anything about that particular machine?" "He bought it new," Della said, "with his army pay, the autumn after he came home from the war, the first war. He told me it was the only machine he ever owned in his life that he loved. He never said why." Clayton Briggs nodded slowly 3 times, as if each nod were settling something in him. He lifted his head and he looked out over the yard, over the 200 upturned faces. And most of those faces were young men in their 20s and 30s, who had been small children or not yet born, when the thing happened that Briggs was about to tell them of. But scattered all through the crowd in the third row and the fifth, along the bleacher rail at the very back, were older men. Men in their 60s and their 70s. And those men were not confused at all. Those men had gone very still and very pale, and one of them, an old farmer near the middle of the third row, with a face like a fence post, had already begun without seeming to know. He was doing it to take off his hat. Most of you, Briggs said to the yard, are too young to know what you are looking at this morning. Most of you walked right past that tractor when you came in and saw nothing but a pile of rust at the end of the line. So, before this girl bids one more dollar, I'm going to tell you what that machine is. And I'm going to tell you who Walter Keller was. And then, if there is any man in this yard who still wants to raise his paddle against the granddaughter of Walter Keller, for the last thing of his she is left in this world, that man can do it. But he is going to have to look me square in the eye while he does. Clint Slater opened his mouth. "Sit down, Mr. Slater," Briggs said, without even turning his head toward him. "Of all the men standing in this yard this morning, you are the very last one who ought to be on his feet." And Clint Slater, who had been ready to argue with a child, who had been ready to stand there and hiss about old grudges across an open grave, looked around. Himself at the silent faces and the hats coming off in the cold one by one, and the auctioneer who had wept at his own stand. And he sat down. He sat down hard on the rough plank bench like a man whose legs had simply stopped agreeing to hold him up. And something moved across his face in that moment that was not hatred, and was not anger, and was not even shame, but was somehow all three of them at once braided together into the look of a man watching a debt he had spent 30 years pretending did not exist, come walking back into the room wearing a dead man's gloves. Della Keller stood in the center of that yard with her paddle still raised, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs that she was certain the men in the front row could hear it, and she did not yet understand what was happening around her. She knew her grandfather had been a good man. She knew he had been a quiet one about it. She knew there were old farmers in the county who tipped their hats to her in the aisles of the feed store and pressed a peppermint into her hand and would not say why their eyes went wet when they looked at her. But she did not yet know the whole of it. She did not yet know about the winter of 1919 or the 9 days or the 47 farms or the reason a 64-year-old auctioneer who had not shown a feeling in 3 decades would break down and weep at the bare sound of her grandfather's name. She was about to learn all of it. They all were. Clayton Briggs wiped his face one last time with the flat of his hand. He picked up his gavel and he held it loose in his fist, not lifted to strike, but held the way a man holds the handle of a door he is about to open onto a room he has not entered in a long time. He drew a breath that the whole silent yard heard him draw. In the winter of 1919, he began this county very nearly died, and the man who kept it alive did it with that exact machine sitting at the end of the line. The one this girl is trying to buy this morning for $100. He let that sit in the cold air. 200 men leaned in, and in the third row, the old farmer with his hat now full against his chest closed his eyes because he had been there in the flesh in his own barn with his own dying cattle, and he remembered every hour of it, and he knew that what was coming next was the truest thing any of these young men around him would hear spoken aloud in the whole of their lives. The ice came on the 14th of January, Briggs said, a freezing rain that began in the gray hour before dawn and did not stop falling for 31 hours. By the time it broke, every wire in 6 counties wore a sleeve of solid ice 2.5 inches around. The telephone lines came down across the roads. The power lines came down. Tree limbs as thick as a man's leg snapped clean off and fell, and you could hear them going all night all across the country. A sound like rifle fire that never stopped. The whole of central Iowa lay under a shell of glass, and it was beautiful, and it was silent, and it was lethal. And the silence was the worst of it, because on a farm in January, silence means the pumps have stopped. He looked out over the yard. Here is the thing. The young men among you do not understand, he said. And I am going to explain it the one time, so I want you to listen close, because I will not lay it out twice. A milk cow drinks somewhere between 10 and 30 gallons of water in a day. Every day she draws breath. She does not take a day off, because the weather has turned hard. In January in this country, that water comes one of two ways. It comes up into a stock tank kept from freezing by a heater that runs on electricity, or it comes up a well by a hand pump. Now, when the ice took down the power lines, every one of those tank heaters died in an hour. And when the cold dropped down to 18 below and then to 22 below in the dark of the second night, every hand pump in the country froze solid in its casing, a useless rod of iron you could not have thawed with a blowtorch. So I want you to picture it. You are a farmer with 40 head of stock in your barn. You have a well full of water you cannot raise and a tank full of ice you cannot break. And your animals have begun to bawl that low, steady, terrible sound they make. And it does not stop. It goes on through the night and into the next day. And there is not one single thing in this world that you can do about it. The yard was dead silent. By the second day of that storm, Briggs said there were hundreds of families across this county, standing in their barns in the cold, watching their herds begin to go down on their knees, from thirst in the dead of winter with water frozen solid 40 feet away from their hands. He paused and his eyes moved across the crowd and found the girl. Walter Keller, he said, was 41 years old that January. He farmed 320 acres up in the northeast corner, the same ground that was sold out from under this child a year ago. He owned 3 tractors. 2 of them were no use to anybody in that ice. But the third was that Waterloo Boy, the 1918, the one he had bought new with his army. Pay the one he loved. And that tractor had a thing on the side of it called a belt pulley, a wide flat wheel that spins right off the turning of the engine, and that a man can loop a long leather belt around to drive other machinery off the motor's power. I'm going to tell you what Walter Keller did with that pulley, Briggs said. And like the rest of it, I'm only going to tell it the one time. He rigged a piston pump to the belt. He hauled a 200-gallon water tank up onto a stone-boat sledge. And he ran that pump off the spinning pulley to draw water straight up out of Keller Creek, which ran fast enough under its own ice that it had not frozen all the way down to the bed. But the genius of the thing, the part no engineer from the college could have drawn up on paper in a warm office, was this. He ran the discharge line, the pipe carrying the pumped water, back along the side of the hot engine block before it reached the tank. And the heat coming off that running motor thawed the line as fast as the cold could try to freeze it. So, while every other pump in 6 counties was a dead bar of frozen iron, Walter Keller had built out of a tractor and a belt and a length of pipe and his own hard head, the one and only rig in the whole region that would still move water at 22 degrees below zero. A low sound moved through the crowd, the sound of men who farm, understanding all at once the sheer, simple brilliance of it. On the morning of the 16th, Briggs said, while the rest of this county was still trying to chop its way out of its own dooryard, Walter Keller drove that tractor out onto the ice roads, and he did not come home again for 9 days. Now, I will tell you what those 9 days were, because the man himself never would. He went from farm to farm. He pumped his tank full from the creek, drove the tank to a neighbor's place, pumped the water into their stock. Trough drove back, filled again, and went on to the next one. He did it in cold that hit 22 below in the dark hours. He did it on roads so glazed over that the tractor slid sideways off into the ditch on him twice. And both times alone in the night with no man within a mile of him, he chained that tractor to a fence post and winched it back up onto the road by hand, with his bare fingers freezing to the cold iron of the chain, and then he climbed back up into that split seat and went on. He slept 3 hours at a stretch in the open cab in that cold, while the tank refilled itself from the creek beside him. And then he woke himself and he went again. How many, a young voice said from somewhere in the crowd. It came out cracked and quiet, a man asking a thing he was not sure he wanted answered. 47 farms, Briggs said. 3,200 head of cattle, across 9 days. And he did the whole of it for nothing. Men tried to put money into his hand, and he would not close his fingers around it. He told them to spend it on feed for the stock he had just watered. There was a young reporter from the county paper who tracked him down on the 8th day, found him asleep sitting up in the cab in some neighbor's yard, and woke him and asked him why he was doing it. And Walter Keller gave him the only answer about it he ever gave to anybody in his whole life. He said any farmer in the county would have done the same if he had owned the rig to do it with. Briggs stopped. He looked down at Della and his voice dropped lower. That was not true, he said. There were 4 other men in this county who owned a Waterloo Boy with a belt pulley that very winter. I know all 4 of their names. I could recite them to you. Every one of those 4 men had the exact same means your grandfather had to do the exact same thing. And not one of them drove past his own fence line. Not one. They sat in their warm kitchens, and they thanked God it was their neighbors and not them. And they were not bad men for it. They were ordinary men, which is most of us. Walter Keller was the only one who went out. He is the only reason a great many of the people in this county were ever born at all. And he never once spoke of it again, not to his own grandchild, who is standing right here this morning learning it from a stranger at an auction. The yard was silent the way a church is silent. And it was into that silence that the old farmer in the 3rd row finally got to his feet. He rose slowly the way a big man rises when his knees have given him 70 years of trouble, and finally quit pretending one hand pressed flat on the shoulder of the man beside him to lever himself up. He was tall, even bent taller than most of the men around him. He had a face like a cedar fence post left out in 40 winters of weather, all grain and crack and grayed wood. And his hat was already in his 2 big hands held against his chest. His name was Silas Hogan, and when he spoke, his voice was the gravel of a man who had spent his whole life shouting to be heard over engines. Clayton, he said, I will say the part you are too kind a man to say. Briggs nodded for him to go on. Silas Hogan turned slowly to face the crowd, and he turned slow on purpose so that every man in that yard was made to meet his old eyes in his turn before he would say another word. I was there, Hogan said. I want every young man here to understand that. I was not told this. I was not raised on it. I was there. In the winter of 1919, I was a young fellow with my own little outfit. 2 miles down the Keller Road, and I had 41 head and a frozen pump, and a baby daughter asleep in the house. And on the 3rd morning of that storm, I stood in my own barn, and I watched my cows go down onto their knees one at a time for want of water. And I got down on my own knees in the straw beside them, and I prayed, which I had not done since I was a boy, at my mother's skirt. And I will tell you what God sent me in answer to that prayer. God sent me a sound. The sound of an engine out on a road that no engine on this earth had any business being out on. He stopped. His jaw worked under the gray skin. When he went on, his voice had thickened to something he had to push the words through. And I will tell you a thing about Walter Keller that nobody knows, he said. Because I fought with him. People do not know that part, and it is the truest part. When Walter came up my lane on the fourth day of it gray in the face, ice frozen solid in his eyebrows, swaying side to side in that seat, like a drunk man fighting to stay sat down, I ran out and I took hold of the fender of that tractor with both hands. And I told him to shut it off and climb down and come into my house. I told him he was going to die out there on the road, that he had done his share, and 10 men's share, and that no man living had the right to ask him to keep on going. And I meant it every word. I had hold of his coat to drag him down out of that seat by force if he would not come. "What did he say?" somebody asked very low. Hogan's mouth pulled up at one corner. It was the closest thing to a smile a man can make when his eyes have gone wet and his voice has gone to gravel. "He looked at me," Hogan said, and he reached down and he peeled my hand off the front of his coat, one finger at a time, gentle the way you would open a child's fist. And he said, "Silas, there are 6 more farms before noon. I have got to keep moving." And then he let in the clutch and he was gone on down the lane into the ice. And I stood there in the cold, like a fool, with my own hand still warm, where it had been against his coat. And I have stood in that exact spot in my mind every cold morning of my life since. Hogan turned slow, and he looked down at Della Keller, and the whole accumulated weight of 28 winters was in his ruined old face. "Girl," he said, "I would sooner take an axe to the hand I am holding this hat with than raise it against you in this yard. And there is not a man in this crowd over the age of 60 who feels 1 inch different." He sat down, lowering himself by the same shoulder he had risen by. And across the whole of that yard, in 2s and 3s, the old men began to take off their hats. But Della was not watching the old men. Della was watching Clint Slater. Because while Silas Hogan had been speaking of the storm, something had been happening in Slater's face. And Della, who had spent her whole short life learning to read the faces of grown men across a supper table, had not been able to make herself look away from it. With every farm Briggs had named, with every detail of the 9 days Slater had grown, not softer the way the others had, but harder the way a man's face goes hard when he is being held down under a truth he cannot stand and cannot escape and cannot drown. And when Hogan said the part about 6 more farms before noon, Slater had flinched. It was a small thing. A tightening of the skin around the eyes gone almost before it came. But Della saw it, and she understood in the way a child sometimes understands a whole thing before she has any words at all to hold it with. That Clint Slater was not a stranger to this story. Clint Slater was somewhere down inside it. "You knew him," Della said again, and louder this time, loud enough that the yard heard her. "You said everyone knew him, but you knew him different from these others. Did you not, Mr. Slater?" Slater stood up. He should not have. Every instinct in that yard had already turned hard against him, and a wiser man would have stayed down on the bench in the cold and let the moment pass over him like weather. But there is a kind of pride that simply cannot sit still while it is being taken apart in public, that would rather burn the whole house down than be seen to be on fire. And Clint Slater had exactly that kind. "You want to know about Walter Keller," he said, and his voice came out ugly and too loud. "You all sit there with your hats off in the cold, like the man was a saint come down to walk among you. Well, I will tell you what your saint did. He let people owe him. That was the whole of his trick. The whole of it. He would not take your money for the help note, because then you would have been square with him and done, and that was the one thing he could not have. So he gave it free, and that way he owned you. My father carried that man's so-called charity around his neck like a millstone for 30 years. I watched it. Every single time the Kellers came into a room, a feed store, a church social, Anywhere, my father had to get up onto his feet like a dog that has been thrown a scrap and nod and be grateful in front of everybody. I grew up watching my own father, a grown man, bow and scrape to a fellow who pumped a little water one cold week, and then spent the rest of his life making sure nobody ever forgot it. The yard had gone dangerously, breathlessly quiet. That is a lie, Silas Hogan said from his seat. He did not say it loud. He said it quiet, and the quiet of it was worse than any shout could have been. Walter Keller never reminded one living soul of one single thing he ever did for them, not once in his life. The reminding was all in your father's own chest. Clint, every bit of it. And you know that as well as I am sitting here. A debt a proud man cannot stand to owe will eat him alive, whether the other fellow ever mentions it or not. And that is a sickness, but it is a sickness of the one who owes and not the one who gave. Your daddy was not a bad man. He was a proud one who could not abide being saved. And you have spent your whole life catching the same fever off him. But Slater was not finished. And now he turned the whole of himself on the girl. And he pointed one thick finger down at the 14-year-old standing there in the dead man's coat. And he said the thing he should never have said. The one thing that turned the entire yard against him forever. In a single breath. Your grandfather, he said, made his big shining name off 47 families. He kept hanging in his debt for 30 years. And then the great man died flat broke and left you with nothing. Nothing. A rusted pile of scrap iron and a wool coat off his own dead back. Because that is what charity buys a girl in the end, is it not? Charity does not feed you. Charity does not keep your farm. So go on, little girl. Go on and buy your monument. Buy your $100 heap and haul it nowhere and sleep in it for all I care in this world. But do not stand there in front of me and let these soft old fools tell you that you are owed one thing by anybody in this county. Because the only thing Walter Keller ever truly left behind him was a long, long list of men too proud to admit out loud how much they hated him. And then he stopped breathing hard through his open mouth because he had said far too much, and he knew it the very instant it had left him, the way a man knows the gun has gone off a half second before he has even decided to pull the trigger. For a long moment, nobody in the yard moved at all. And then a new voice came from the rim of the yard, from over by the chain-link fence. And it was a voice that no one in the crowd had heard yet that morning. Quiet and level and absolutely terribly certain. And every head in that whole yard turned toward it at once. His name was Walter Keller, the voice said. And he is the only reason I lived to see the age of 5. Dennis Roth stepped away from the fence. He came forward through the crowd in his gray overcoat, and the men parted to let him through without quite knowing why they did it, the way a crowd will part for a man whose face has something on it they do not want to be standing in front of. He walked all the way up to the open ground in the middle of the yard, where Della stood and where Clint Slater still stood, breathing hard, and he stopped there between them. And he turned and faced the man who had been spitting on the dead. "My name is Dennis Roth," he said, and he said it to the whole yard, not to Slater. "Some of you know me. I work for the bank in Des Moines. I am the loan officer who signed the foreclosure on the Keller estate last spring. I am the reason this auction is being held this morning at all. Every lot you have bid on today, every plow and every tractor is up for sale because I put my stamp on a piece of paper. So you can believe me when I tell you that I have got no soft feelings to defend here and no reason in the world to stand up for the Keller name. I did my job. I did it exactly the way the bank instructed me to do it by the book to the letter. And I have not slept one whole night through since." He turned then and he looked down at Della, and for the first time since she had seen him in the corner of that county office a year before. The careful gray blankness was gone entirely out of his face, and what was left underneath it was raw and open and could not be looked at easily. "You do not know me," he said to her quietly. "You were a baby." But in the January of 1919, I was 4 years old, on a poor little place out past the Jasper County line, and the storm took our power and froze our well exactly like everybody else's. And my mother told me the story of what happened next so many times across my whole childhood that I can stand here and give it back to you, word for word the way she told it. She said a man came up our lane on the 7th day of it, driving a tractor that had no earthly business still running. She said he was so far gone with the cold that he could not work his own fingers, that when she brought him out a cup of hot coffee, he could not close his hands around it, and she had to hold the cup up to his mouth herself and tip it for him so he could drink. She said he pumped water for our 6 cows and our 2 horses, all of them already down, and most of a day from dead. And when she begged him with tears running down her face to please come inside and warm himself by the stove for just 1 hour, before he went on, he shook his head and he told her there were still farms ahead of him, and he climbed back up into that seat and he drove off into the dark with the cup of coffee gone cold in her hand. She said his name was Walter Keller, and every single time she told it, every time right up until the year she died, she ended it the same way. She said, "Dennis, you are alive because of that man. Because a barn full of dead cattle in that storm meant a family starved out by the spring, and we were already too poor that one bad season would have been the end of all of us." Roth's voice did not rise. That was the terrible thing about it, the thing that held the whole yard pinned. He spoke the entire confession in the flat, even unhurried tone of a man reading out a sentence in a courtroom. His own sentence. "I did not put it together," he said, "until it was already done, until I had already stamped the papers and mailed them. I knew the name Keller my whole life long. My mother said it like a prayer over my bed. And then I sat down at a desk a lifetime later, and I foreclosed on that same man's land. And I did not let myself remember why the name pulled at me, because remembering would have made the work impossible, and a man has got to eat. And the bank does not care who your mother prayed for. So I made myself forget. I'm good at my job, and being good at my job means I have gotten very, very good at forgetting. I forgot so completely that I signed away the farm of the one man who kept me alive. And I sold his orphaned granddaughter's home out from under her to an investment group in the city. And the whole time I told myself it was only a form. Only a form. Just a piece of paper with a line on it for my name. He turned back to Slater. And when he spoke to Slater, his voice was almost gentle, which was the worst thing of all. "So you stand there," Roth said, "and you tell this child that her grandfather kept men hanging in his debt. You want to talk to me about debt, Clint? I am the man standing in this yard who knows the most in all the world about it. I owe Walter Keller every single day I have been alive since I was 4 years old, and I paid the man back for it by taking his land and putting his granddaughter in a stranger's spare room. So do not you lecture a 14-year-old girl about debts that go unpaid. You and I are the only 2 men in this whole yard who never paid ours. That is the only thing you and I have got in common. The single, solitary difference between us, Clint, is that I have got just enough decency left in me to be ashamed of it. And you have got none." The silence in the yard was complete and total. And then Silas Hogan got to his feet again, slow by the same shoulder. And beside him a second old farmer stood. And then a third, farther back. And Della watched with her paddle still half raised and forgotten in her hands. As one by one all across that yard, the old men rose up onto their feet with their hats already in their hands. And not one of them was looking at the auctioneer anymore. And not one of them was looking at the girl. They were all of them looking at Clint Slater. And there was nothing in any of those weathered old faces but the flat, ancient final judgment of men who had carried a debt their whole lives long and meant to carry it honorably into their graves, looking now upon a man who had spent his own whole life despising that very same debt and calling his shame by the name of pride. Clint Slater looked at the wall of standing men. He looked at the girl. He looked last of all at Dennis Roth, who had just stood up in front of 200 people and confessed the worst thing in his entire life out loud in order to defend a child he had wronged, and who was looking back at Slater now with something on his face that was almost unbearably pity. And pity was the one single thing on this earth that Clint Slater could not stand to be shown. And Clint Slater turned and he walked out of the yard. He did not run. He walked stiff and fast between the men who parted to let him pass out through the gate past the parked trucks, frosted white in the cold. And he did not look back, not once. And the entire crowd watched him go, in a silence so deep and so complete that you could hear his boots crunching on the frozen gravel of the lane long after the man himself had gone out of sight beyond the trucks. He would not come back. He would sell his place inside of 5 years and pull up his stakes and move out west, and his name would fall out of the county's mouth entirely within a decade, which is the cleanest and the most complete way that a man can ever be forgotten. Clayton Briggs let out a long, slow breath. He picked his gavel back up off the stand. His hands, Della saw, had steadied. "If there is no man here," Briggs said to the yard, and his voice was rough, but it was clear. And it carried, "Who wishes to raise his paddle against Miss Della Keller for lot number 23? Then I am going to close this lot at $100. And I am going to count it until the day they bury me the proudest gavel I ever brought down in 31 years of bringing them down." No paddle rose. No voice spoke. The wind moved through the chain link, and a crow called once far off. And that was all. And Clayton Briggs brought the gavel down, and the crack of it went across that yard like a rifle shot in the cold, still air. And he said, "Sold. Lot 23, the 1918 Waterloo Boy, to Miss Della Keller of Mitchellville, Iowa for $100. Della Keller lowered her paddle. Her arms had gone numb clear to the shoulder from holding it up at her chest for so long. And when she finally let it down, the blood came rushing back into them in a hot, painful flood. And somewhere in the middle of that flood, she realized that she was crying. And she did not try to stop it. And she did not try to hide it or to wipe it away, because there was no longer a single person in that entire yard that she needed to hide anything from. She walked forward toward the auctioneer's table on legs that did not feel as if they belonged to her to go and pay for her grandfather's tractor. The $100 already counted out and folded apart from the rest of the money in its own separate fold, because she had counted it 3 times the night before and kept it separate on purpose, so that in the one moment that mattered her cold hands would not fumble and shame her. She paid. Nora Vaughn filled out the paperwork for her with a hand that shook worse than the girl's own, and when she pushed the receipt across the table, she held on to the far corner of it for 1 second longer than she needed to. Just one. And she leaned in close and said very low, so that only Della would hear it, "My father was farm number 19. He is 81 years old, and he is sitting at home by his stove this very morning. And when I drive out there tonight and I tell him whose granddaughter I sold a tractor to today, that old man is going to cry right into his supper." Della took the receipt. She held it tight in her grandfather's glove, and she walked out across the yard to the back of the equipment line, to the rusted Waterloo Boy sitting there on its 2 flat tires with its split seat and its paint gone the color of dried blood. And she reached up and laid her gloved hand flat against the cold iron of the steering wheel on the gray, worn place where her grandfather's two hands had rested. 10,000 mornings of his life. And she stood there holding onto it with the weak, white morning sun coming up over the fairgrounds behind her. And that should have been the end of it. A girl, a tractor, a debt remembered, and a debt repaid, all of it inside a single November hour. If the story had ended right there at the wheel with the sun coming up, it would already have been a story worth the telling and worth your time to hear. But it was Silas Hogan who broke that moment. And it was Silas Hogan who turned it into something else entirely. He had come down out of the bleachers slow and careful on his ruined knees, and he had crossed the yard to where the girl stood with her hand on the wheel, and 7 or 8 of the old men had drifted along after him, drawn the way iron filings are drawn to a magnet, without any one of them deciding to come, until there was a loose half-circle of gray-haired farmers standing in the cold around the tractor and the child. Miss Keller, Hogan said, "I have got to ask you a hard question, and I want you to answer me honest. How are you fixing to get this machine home?" And Della Keller, who had planned out every single dollar and every bus fare and every careful lie, who had counted her money 3 separate times and kept the 100 folded apart, so her hands would not shake, looked up at the old man, and for the first time all morning she had no answer ready in her mouth. "I do not know yet," she said. And the truth of it landed in her own chest as she heard herself say it out loud. The cookie tin had bought the bid. It had not bought a flatbed trailer or a hauler with a winch or 1 square foot of ground to set 2,000 pounds of dead iron down upon. "I will figure it out," she said, which is the thing a person says when they have not figured out one single thing at all. Silas Hogan nodded slow. He looked around at the men gathered with him. Some private thing passed between all of them in that one look, an entire conversation conducted by old men, entirely in glances the way men talk, who have known each other 60 years and buried each other's wives. And then Hogan turned back to the girl, and he took his hat off his head one more time, and he held it against his chest. The way he had held it when Briggs first spoke her grandfather's name. "Child," he said, "there are men standing in this circle right now whose father's herds your grandfather watered with his own 2 frozen hands in the winter of 1919. There are men standing here who would not have a farm left to pass down to a son, nor a family name to pass it down under, if Walter Keller had stayed home that week and minded his own like a sensible man. We have carried that for 28 years, every one of us. And in all that time, we have never once had a single way on this earth to set it down." He paused. His old eyes were wet, and they were steady. "So you are not going to figure out how to get this tractor home," he said, "because we are going to take it from here. You hear me? New tires, a new battery. We will go all the way through that engine bolt by bolt, and we will not stop until it runs the way it ran on the morning it pulled this whole county back from the edge of its own grave. And you are not going to pay us 1 thin dime for any of it, because there is not enough money minted in the whole United States to settle what this circle of men owes the man who owned that machine. The only thing we are going to ask of you in return is that you let us do it." Della opened her mouth, but before she could speak, before the old man could finish the thing, they had just begun. A long black sedan came rolling slow up the gravel lane at the edge of the fairgrounds. A city car, a car that did not belong within 10 miles of a foreclosure auction. And it pulled to a stop just past the gate, and both of its front doors swung open at once, and 2 men in good city overcoats stepped out into the cold. The taller of the 2 unfolded a sheet of paper, and he raised his head, and he looked across the whole length of the yard, past the crowd directly at the rusted tractor and the small girl standing beside it. And he called out in a smooth, carrying voice that cut clean across the morning. "We are looking for the buyer of the Keller equipment," the man said. "There has been a mistake made with this sale. That machine is not hers to take." The yard, which had only just learned how to breathe again, stopped breathing all over. The two men came forward through the crowd, and the crowd did not part to let them through the way it had parted for Dennis Roth. The two men in the overcoats had to turn themselves sideways and push, and the farmers gave up the ground grudgingly, an inch at a time, the way a plowed field gives up ground under the boots of a man who has no honest business crossing it. The taller of the two was perhaps 50 years old, smooth-shaven, soft-handed, with the kind of face that has spent its entire working life behind a desk, telling other people no, and being paid well for it. The shorter man trailing him carried a leather folder tucked under his arm, like a shield he was hiding behind. The tall man stopped at the very edge of the half-circle of old farmers, and he looked at the rusted tractor. And then he looked at the girl standing beside it, with her gloved hands still flat on the wheel. And Della watched him decide in a single quick downward glance that of everything standing in that yard, she was by a wide margin the easiest thing to move. "My name is Brock Steele," he said. "I represent the investment group that purchased the Keller acreage at the foreclosure last spring. 320 acres, the northeast quarter, Polk County. We hold clear and recorded title." "I know who holds the land," Della said. Her voice was small, but it did not waver. "The land is not the tractor. I bid on the tractor. I paid for the tractor. I have got the receipt right here in my hand." Brock Steele smiled down at her the way a man smiles at a child who has done a long division problem correctly and expects to be praised for it. "That is precisely the mistake," he said. "You see, the tractor was listed in the estate equipment inventory, that is true. But our purchase agreement was written to include all fixtures and appurtenances of the property as they stood on the date of the sale. And there is a question, a legal question, a genuine gray area about whether farm implements that were stored upon the land at the time of transfer pass along with the land or with the estate. Our attorneys take the view that they pass with the land, which would make this tractor the property of my group. We drove out this morning to stop the sale before it could be finalized, and I am afraid we have arrived just in the nick of time." "You are too late," Clayton Briggs said from his stand, flat and hard. "The gavel is down. The lot is sold and it is paid for in full." "A gavel is not a court of law," Steele said, without bothering to turn around. He kept his eyes fixed on the girl where the soft part of the yard was. "A sale made in error can be unwound, and the county is not going to want a lawsuit over a $100 tractor any more than my group does. So here is what I am prepared to do, young lady. Because whatever these men may want you to think of me, I am not a cruel man. I'm going to refund your $100 to you, in cash. Right here, right now, out of my own pocket. And I am going to put $50 on top of it for your trouble and your disappointment. $150 in your hand today for a machine that does not run, that you cannot move, that you have no place on God's earth to keep. That is a generous offer. That is more than generous. If I were you, I would take it." He reached into his overcoat and drew out a fat billfold, and he began to count crisp bills out into his own open palm, one, and then another, and then another. And the soft sound of the paper money was loud in the frozen silence of the yard. And for a moment, it was the only sound in the whole world. And Della Keller looked at the money in the man's hand, and then she looked up at the man's smooth face. And something happened in her in that moment. Something that had been building and building since a cold March morning in a milking barn. since 9 months of crying into a dead boy's pillow through a stranger's wall, since 37 weeks of 75-cent afternoons and a column of small numbers climbing up the back of a clipped paragraph. And she let go of the steering wheel and she stood up straight to the full of her height, all 4 feet and 11 inches of her. And she said the one word that she would remember saying for the rest of her entire life. No. Steele stopped counting. No, Della said again and louder. You can keep your $150, Mr. Steele. And you can keep your attorneys too. Because you are wrong about the law. And I can stand right here and tell you exactly how you are wrong. A low sound moved through the ring of old men around her. A sound that was almost a laugh, and was almost a growl, and was entirely something else. I read the Iowa Code, Della said. I read the whole of it. I read it in the back of the school library 3 afternoons a week, for a solid month at the table. With the green lamp after I read the part about a 14-year-old being able to make a contract. Because I figured somebody someday was going to try exactly this. Implements only pass with the land if they are affixed to it. Fixtures. That word means bolted down, built in, made a permanent part of the real property so that you could not take it away without tearing up the ground. A tractor is not a fixture. A tractor has wheels on it. A tractor is the single most personal piece of personal property that a farm owns, and it passes with the estate, not the land. And this one was listed in the estate inventory by its serial number in writing, which means the bank knew full well it was estate property on the day they wrote up your purchase agreement. So if your attorneys told you any different, Mr. Steele, then your attorneys were not confused about the law. They were just hoping I was too young to be able to read it. Brock Steele's smile did not move on his mouth, but his eyes did. You are a child, he said. He said it quietly now. The performance had gone out of his voice entirely. I am the child, Della said, who bid against 200 grown men in this yard this morning and won. So go right ahead. Sue me for my tractor. Take an orphan to court over a $100 machine that the man who saved this entire county bought new with his own army pay. Stand up in a Polk County courtroom in front of a Polk County jury and tell them that what you want, what you drove all the way out here in your fine car to get, is to take it back from his granddaughter. I'll be sitting right there in that courtroom when you do it, and I will bring every single one of these men with me. And the half-circle of old farmers without one word passing among them took a single step inward, all of them at once, and closed the ring tighter around the girl and the tractor, so that Brock Steele found himself looking now not at a child standing alone, but at a solid wall of gray-haired men who had buried their own fathers and fully intended to bury this argument right alongside them. Steele looked at the wall of men. Then he looked over at Dennis Roth, who had walked across to stand at the edge of the ring with the rest of them. You work for the bank, Steele said to Roth. So tell her. Implements stored upon the property. Tell her what your own attorneys would say. I do work for the bank, Roth said. And I am the man who wrote the estate inventory with my own hand. I listed that tractor under estate equipment by its serial number in ink, because that is exactly what it was. And I knew what it was when I wrote it down. The girl has got the law dead to rights, Mr. Steele, and you know that she does. And so do your attorneys, which is the precise reason they sent you out here to waive $150 at a 14-year-old child instead of filing a single sheet of paper with the court. There is no lawsuit. There was never going to be any lawsuit. There was only ever the hope that she would take the money and not know any better. And as it happens, she knows a great deal better. The yard waited, and Brock Steele, who was not in truth a cruel man, and who was very certainly not a stupid one, did the cold, quick arithmetic that smooth men always do, and he closed his billfold and put it back inside his coat. He had come out here for $100 a tractor as a matter of pure principle to establish for the record that his group did not lose things, did not let things slip, was not to be trifled with by farmers. And he had found instead a courtroom already waiting for him out here in the cold, with the jury already seated, and the jury already wearing its hats against its chest. There was no profit in it. There had never been any profit in it. There was only a girl who had read the code twice and a yard full of witnesses who would walk into any courthouse in the state to back her in a story that would follow his company's name through every single land deal it ever tried to make in this county for the rest of time. "The machine is yours," he said to Della. There was no warmth at all in how he said it, and there was no cruelty in it either. It was the flat, clean sound of a ledger being closed. He turned to go, and then he stopped. And he turned halfway back. And he looked at her once more. And something that was almost against his own will, respect, crossed his smooth, desk-shaped face. "You read the whole code," he said. "To get ready for this. You actually sat and read the whole thing." "Twice," said Della. Steele looked at her for one long moment. Then he nodded just once, and he walked back to the long black sedan with the shorter man hurrying along in his wake, and the car backed slowly down the frozen gravel lane and was gone. And the cold dust of its leaving hung gold for a moment in the low morning light, and the whole yard let out the breath it had been holding all at once in a great cloud of steam in the cold. Silas Hogan started laughing first. It came out of him as a wheezing, delighted, disbelieving sort of laugh, and it spread through the ring of old men the way the cruel laughter had spread through the young ones an hour before, except that this laughter had not 1 ounce of cruelty anywhere in it, only the pure, helpless joy of men who have just watched a child do a thing they will be telling one another about over coffee and across fence lines for the whole rest of their short remaining lives. Twice Hogan wheezed, wiping at his eyes. She read it twice, and then he put one big hand down on Della's shoulder, and the laughter went out of him as fast as it had come up, and he said gently, "Now, where were we before we were interrupted? Will you let us bring your grandfather's tractor home for you?" Della looked around the ring at the faces of the old men. She looked at Dennis Roth, standing at the edge of them, the bank's own man, the one who had signed away her home, and then stood up in the cold and confessed it out loud in front of all of them. She looked at the rusted iron her grandfather had loved above every other thing he owned, and she found that she could not make a single word come out of her throat. So she only nodded once, and the nod was enough. The nod was everything. "Where is it gonna live?" Hogan asked her gentle. "You told us you were staying with your aunt in town. You have got no place to keep it." And here a younger man among the old ones stepped forward out of the ring. He was broad as a barn door across the shoulders, and he had not said one single word all morning long. His name was Wade Donovan, and he farmed 6 miles east of Mitchellville. And he said in a voice like a load of gravel rolling slow downhill, "My place has a machine shed standing half empty. I will keep this tractor for you, Della Keller, for just exactly as long as you need it kept, free of any charge. And when you are grown and you have got a place of your own to put it, you come out and you get it, and it will be there waiting and it will run. You have my hand on that." He held out his hand. It was the size of a dinner plate and the color of old saddle leather. "Are you sure?" Della said. Child Wade Donovan said, "My own father was farm number 26. I am as sure of this as I have ever been about one single thing in the whole of my life." She took his hand, and the deal was done the only way that deals were ever truly done in that county, with a bare hand in the cold and nothing whatsoever written down on paper. They kept their word. Of course they kept their word. These were men for whom a given word was the very last thing they owned in this world that no bank on earth could ever foreclose on. Inside of 6 weeks, the 1918 Waterloo Boy had been brought all the way back from the dead. New tires hauled in from a dealer in Des Moines. A new battery. The carburetor torn down and rebuilt by hand on a workbench in Wade Donovan's shed under a bare hanging bulb. The engine pulled apart and gone through, bolt by bolt and gasket by gasket. Every part that could be saved. Cleaned in a coffee can of gasoline. And every part that could not replaced out of the old men's own pockets. And out of the deep, dusty drawers of farmers who had been hoarding parts for machines like this one since before the Second War. They hit one bad stretch where a cracked block looked like it would beat them, and 3 of them drove the whole of a Sunday across the state to pull a usable block off a Waterloo Boy rusting in a fence row, and traded a side of beef for it, and drove it home in the dark, and not one of them counted it a hardship. They matched the green paint as close as any living man could match a color that had not been mixed in 30 years. The work got done on Saturdays by men in their 60s and their 70s, every one of whom had been touched in his own life by Walter Keller's 9 days, either with his own eyes or through the eyes of a father who had told it to him. And they did the work, the slow, careful way that men do work, that is secretly a prayer with their sleeves rolled and their hats on and very few words spoken. And on a Saturday in January, on a cold, bright morning that fell very near the anniversary of the storm itself, they fired it for the first time. Della was there. Wade Donovan had sent word into town, and Mabel Carver, who had not said one word to the girl about the tractor. Since the morning of the auction had driven her out to the farm, in a silence with her lips pressed thin and her hands tight on the wheel. The 2 of them had reached an unspoken sort of truce across the weeks since November. A truce built on the simple bedrock fact that Mabel could not stay angry at a child who had been proven so completely and so publicly right. And Della, for her part, could not stay closed up against the only person left alive in the whole world who had ever told her not to go, because she loved her too much to watch her get hurt. The old men gathered in close around the machine in the shed. Wade Donovan set the spark and worked the choke and bent his big back and turned it over by hand, and the engine coughed and caught and died. And he set himself and turned it again, and it caught. And this time it held. It ran rough as a cob for a moment hunting. And then it found itself and it settled, and it filled the whole shed up with a slow, heavy, living heartbeat of a sound, the deep 2-cylinder thump of a motor that had been built before most of the men standing in that shed had even been born. And one by one, every one of those hard old men went silent, because it was the sound. It was the exact sound. It was the sound that on a black January morning in 1919 had come up a frozen lane and meant that someone was coming, that the cattle would not die after all, that the family was not going to be starved out by the spring. Every man in that shed had heard that exact sound in his own barn or in his father's barn come up out of the killing cold and mean the difference between living and not living. And here it was again alive and thumping in a shed in the year 1947. And not one of those weathered old men was the least bit ashamed of what was running down his face. Della climbed up into the seat. She put both her hands on the wheel where her grandfather's hands had worn the finish gray. And she sat up there with the engine running warm and steady beneath her. And she did not say one word for the better part of an hour. And not a single man interrupted her or asked her to come down. And when at last she did climb down, she went straight to Wade Donovan. And she put her 2 arms around the middle of him as far as they would reach, which was not very far. And she said into the front of his coat, "Thank you for holding it. I have not even started holding it yet." Wade Donovan said. His voice was not steady. "I have only just gotten started." And Mabel Carver stood there, in the open door of the shed, with one hand pressed over her mouth, and on the long drive back to town. In the cold, she reached over without looking, and took Della's hand in her own, and held onto it the whole way home. And neither one of them said a single word the entire drive. And that was the day on that frozen road that the war between the two of them quietly ended for good. The tractor lived in Wade Donovan's shed for 8 years. Della came out to visit it. The first year, every few months, riding the rural bus and then walking the last stretch. By the time she was 16, she could drive the thing, and Wade taught her himself on his own ground, walking alongside in the stubble with one hand on the fender, and shouting over the engine, and on a Saturday she would take it out across his fields and bring it back, smelling of fuel and turned earth, and Wade would stand in the shed door and shake his head and grin at the sight of her up there in the seat, a Keller on a Waterloo Boy again, the way the world was supposed to look. She finished high school, and she finished it well enough that the county extension agent took notice of her and made some telephone calls on her behalf. And she went on to study agricultural science at the State College, the first Keller in 3 living generations to sit in a classroom past the 8th grade. She worked the summers in the extension office for wages, and she lived on next to nothing. And she saved every dollar she did not strictly need to live. And she kept folded in the bottom of a desk drawer, a plan which she added to a little at a time, year after year, the way her grandfather had taught her, never beginning a hard job until she had already worked out how it would finish, because the tractor was never the whole of it. The tractor was only the first move on the board. The tractor was proof of a thing Della had understood standing in that auction yard at 14, and had spent the next 8 years quietly arming herself to act upon, which was that a thing taken can sometimes be taken back, that the land could come home too. There was a year in the middle of college, her 3rd year, when she nearly gave the whole of it up. The money ran short the way money does, and a professor she had crossed by being right when he was wrong made her path harder than it had any cause to be. And she sat in a cold, rented room one February night with the plan spread out on the desk in front of her, and a head full of every sensible reason in the world to fold it up and put it away and be content with a tractor and a degree and a life that did not break her heart. She wrote a letter to Mabel that night, not asking permission, only saying that maybe the old woman had been right all those years ago. Maybe a person ought to let the dead rest and live the life in front of her. And Mabel, who was old now and whose own hand shook on the page, wrote back 4 lines. She wrote that she had spent her whole life telling Della to let the iron go, and that she had been wrong about it, dead wrong, and that she had known she was wrong the morning that engine fired up in Wade Donovan's shed, and she watched the girl's face. She wrote that there was a difference she had not understood between a person who digs at a grave to climb back in and a person who digs to build something on the spot. And she wrote at the bottom that Walter Keller never quit a thing in his life, and his granddaughter was not about to be the first Keller to learn how. Della read it 4 times, and then she unfolded the plan again, and she stayed. In the year 1955, the year Della turned 22 and finished her degree, the 320 acres came up for sale. The land had passed after Brock Steele's group finally lost its patience with ground. It had never had any intention of farming into the hands of a holding company that leased it out to a tenant year by year and sat on it and waited for the price of dirt to climb. And in the spring of 1955, that holding company put the Keller acreage on the open market. The asking price was $40,000, which in that year was a fortune past anything that a young woman with an extension office salary could so much as dream of touching. Della had $4,000 saved. It was nothing. It was a tenth of what she needed. And on a Saturday in March, she drove out to Wade Donovan's farm, and she climbed up into the cab of her grandfather's tractor and sat there for the better part of an hour, the way she always did when she had a hard thing to think clear through. And then she climbed down, and she went into the house, and she asked Wade Donovan the question she had been carrying folded up inside her for 8 long years. "Mr. Donovan," she said, "do you remember the men who stood up in the yard that morning? The ones who took their hats off when Mr. Briggs said my grandfather's name?" "I remember every last one of them," Wade said. "I could draw you where each man was standing. Are any of them still farming? Are there enough of them left?" Wade Donovan looked at her for a long, long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that was one part pride and one part the first beginning of tears. "What is it you are thinking, child?" he said. "I'm thinking," Della said, "that my grandfather saved 47 farms in the winter of 1919. And I am thinking that some of those farms grew up across the years into real operations with real money behind them, run by real men. Men who maybe could help the granddaughter of the man who saved them buy back his land. Not as charity. I will say that part plain. I will not take charity I never have in my life, and I am not about to start. As partners, as an investment. I would farm the ground myself, with my own 2 hands and my degree. They would put up the purchase money, and we would split what the land made between us year by year, until I could buy them back out at a fair and honest price. I have got it all written down. I have had it written down for 4 years. I only ever needed to know one thing before I showed it to anybody: whether there were enough of them left alive to do it." Wade Donovan did not answer her right away. He got up from the kitchen table, slow on his own knees now, and he walked across the room to a desk in the corner, and he pulled open a drawer, and he lifted out of it a single sheet of paper, yellowed all over, and gone soft as cloth at the folds, from being opened and folded shut 100 times across the years. He carried it back to the table, and he sat down heavy, and he smoothed it out flat under one big hand. "Della," he said, "after the storm, my father started a list, the 47 farms. He wrote down every name on this page, because he used to say that a debt you do not write down somewhere is a debt you have already half decided to let yourself forget." And he was not ever going to let himself forget. When he died, he put this paper into my hand, and he told me to keep it up. And I have kept it up. I have crossed off the farms that sold, and the farms that went under in the hard years, and the farms whose families packed up and left the county. I have sat down at this table and done it every single year for 36 years. He turned the paper around so that it faced her. "There are 31 farms still standing and still operating in this county," he said, "that were saved in the winter of 1919. 31 of them. I know every man who runs every one. Most of them were standing in that yard the morning you bought your tractor. And every single one of them has spent the whole of his life carrying a debt he has never once been given any way on this earth to set down." He looked up at her across the table. "Show me your plan," Wade Donovan said. Della showed him the plan. It was 11 pages long. She had written it and rewritten it for 4 years, sitting up nights, and it was good. It was honest, and it was tight, and it was fair to every man. It touched good enough that Wade Donovan read the whole of it through twice, without saying one word. And then he reached up and took the telephone down off the wall of his kitchen, and he began to make calls. Inside of 2 weeks, 12 farmers had committed. Inside of 4 weeks, the consortium had pooled $40,000 in hard cash money, raised from the operations of men whose fathers' herds a dead man had watered in an ice storm, before half of them were even born. and inside of 6 weeks on a June morning in the year 1955. 8.5 years after a 14-year-old girl in a dead man's gloves had walked alone into a foreclosure yard with $340 and a plan she had told to no living soul. The 320 acres of the Keller farm came home. Della signed the papers on the table in Wade Donovan's kitchen. 12 old farmers stood in a loose half circle around the table, the very same kind of half circle they had made around her tractor in the auction yard. And they watched her hand move steady across the line that brought the family ground. Back, and when she set the pen down, Silas Hogan, who was older now and walked on 2 canes and whose voice had gone thin as paper, said, "Walter, your girl brought it home." And the 12 of them stood there in the lamplight with their eyes wet and their backs straight, asking no man's pardon for any of it. She farmed her first crop in the spring of 1956. Corn and soybeans turned one against the other in rotation. No debt against the place that was not shared equipment, borrowed and lent back and forth across a dozen operations. The old way, the way it had all been done before, the banks taught a generation of men to do everything alone. She used the 1918 Waterloo Boy for the light work. Around the place, the tractor she had bought for $100 at the age of 14, restored by old men who owed her grandfather their very lives, kept safe. 8 winters in Wade Donovan's shed, and driven home at last, up the same lane it had been driven down on the morning Walter Keller went out into the storm and did not come back for 9 days. She bought out her partners in the year 1969, a full year ahead of the schedule she had written into her own plan at the age of 22. Several of them flatly refused to take the final payment. Wade Donovan refused it loudest of all of them. He told her that watching her bring that farm back from the dead had been the finest thing he had been alive on this earth to see, and that a man does not charge a person admission to the finest thing he ever saw. And that, more or less, brings us to where the story can be told from, because the reason it can be told at all is that the people who lived it are not yet all of them gone. And the woman at the very center of it sat down across a kitchen table not so long ago and told the whole of it through from the cold yard to the warm field all the way to the end. Della Keller is 53 years old now. She farms 480 acres. The original 320. Her grandfather first broke with that same tractor, and another 160. She bought a few years back from a neighbor who was retiring out. She has a daughter born in the year 1962 named Stella, who is 24 now and finishing a graduate degree in agricultural engineering at the state college, and who is coming home to the farm in the spring. And that last part is the thing that makes Della's voice go soft and catch when she gets to it, because it means the ground will pass on whole into the hands of a 4th generation of Kellers, which is a thing that on a cold November morning in 1947 did not look possible to one single living soul who was standing in that yard. The Waterloo Boy sits today in the equipment shed beside the big modern tractors dwarfed by them and outlasting them all. Della starts it twice every year, once in the spring and once in the fall. And on the morning of the 16th of January, every single year without one exception. The anniversary of the day in 1919 that her grandfather started his 9-day drive out into the ice. She fires that old engine and lets it warm itself. And she climbs up into the seat and drives it slow all the way around the perimeter of the home quarter section alone in the cold, in the gray light before the sun. And the whole way around, she listens to the deep, slow 2-cylinder heartbeat of it, the sound that once meant that somebody was coming to help. She keeps that appointment with the dead the way other people keep appointments with the living faithfully on the day in all weather, because she has never once in her entire life let herself forget what was done for her and for the people all around her by a man who would not have been able to tell you why he did it. Beyond that, the cattle were dying and he had the only rig that would move water. Clayton Briggs called auctions for 9 more years. He retired in 1956, the very spring that Della planted her first crop on the home ground. And he drove out to the place to watch her do it. And he stood at the edge of the field in his old sheepskin coat, with his hands behind his back. And he did not say much because he never was a man who needed to. He died in 1963 at the age of 80. Della drove the Waterloo Boy to the cemetery and parked it at the edge of the lot during the burial. Idling low, and Silas Hogan, leaning hard on his 2 canes at the graveside, looked over at it and said to her, "Clayton would have liked that." And Della said, "I know." Silas Hogan lived to be 96 years old. He died in his own bed on his own ground. The ground his father's herd had once been watered to save, and Della was there with him at the end, and she held his old hand through the last of it, and the last thing he ever said in this world. His voice gone down to barely more than the rattle of his own breath was 6 more farms before noon. And then the corner of his mouth pulled up, and then he was gone. And Della understood, sitting there holding the hand of the man, that he had been hearing her grandfather's voice come up a frozen lane across 57 years of his life, clear and steady right up to the final second of it. Clint Slater sold his farm in 1951 and moved out west, just exactly the way the whole county had quietly known all along that he would. He died years later in a small rented apartment in a desert town, a long, long way from any field. And his obituary in the local paper ran 3 lines, and nobody in Polk County cut it out, and nobody saved it. And that is the whole and the entire sum of what became of the man who laughed first and laughed loudest. Dennis Roth left the bank inside of a year of that auction. He could not bring himself to stamp another single form after that morning, he told Della long afterward, because every form he picked up had her grandfather's face looking up out of it. He bought himself a small, poor place out past the Jasper County line, near the very ground his own family had been farming when he was 4 years old. And an engine came up the lane through the ice and saved their cattle. And he farmed it badly and happily for the rest of his days. He and Della stayed friends until the end of his life. And at his funeral, it was Della who got up to speak, and she said only one thing about him. She said that he was the rarest kind of man. There is the kind who is brave enough to be ashamed. And then she sat back down, and the whole church was quiet, because everybody sitting in it understood exactly what she had meant. Mabel Carver lived long enough to see the land come home. She was very old by then and going blind, and she could not make the drive out herself. So on a June evening in 1955, Della drove the Waterloo Boy the 6 miles into town and parked it idling in the street outside the little clapboard house, and helped the old woman out onto the porch and put her 2 soft hands on the warm metal of the fender so that she could feel the heartbeat of the engine she had once begged the girl to let go of. Mabel stood there a long while with her blind eyes shut and her hands on the iron, listening. And then she said, "I was wrong about you, child. And I have never in my life been so glad to be wrong about a single thing." She died peacefully the following winter, and Della buried her beside the husband and the son, and saw to it that the boy's blue room was finally, after all those years, opened up and aired out and given to the living. Wade Donovan is 91 years old now. He lives in an assisted living home over in Des Moines these days, and Della drives in to see him twice every month without fail, and she carries him photographs of the crops and a thermos of coffee made in her own kitchen. The last time she went to see him, he held on to her hand for a long, long time without saying anything at all, the way very old men go quiet when the words have grown too big to fit back out through the door of the mouth. And then he said, "Della, I held that tractor for you for 8 years. And I have got to tell you something I have never told you. Those were the proudest 8 years of my entire life. And Della Keller, who is 53 years old now, who has faced down city lawyers and laughing crowds and the deaths of very nearly everyone who ever loved her, put her head down on the old man's shoulder in that small, bright room and cried like the 14-year-old girl she had once been. In a yard full of strangers, and he patted her hair with a hand the size of a dinner plate, slow and steady, and neither one of them said one more word because there was nothing else left that needed saying between them. Most 14-year-old girls do not walk alone into a foreclosure yard with $340 saved up out of minding other people's children. Most do not face down 200 laughing men with a wooden paddle held in a dead man's gloves, or stand toe-to-toe with a lawyer in a city overcoat and quote the property code back at him until he folds, or spend 8 patient years building a plan to bring back the very ground that was taken away from them. Della Keller did every one of those things. And the reason that she could do them is that her grandfather in the winter of 1919 had done a far harder thing for no reason at all in the world, except that there was an emergency standing in front of him, and he happened to own the one machine that could meet it and could see no good reason to stay home. Walter Keller did not save those 47 farms because he was hoping that someday, somehow, a granddaughter of his might need a yard full of grateful men. He did it because the cattle were dying, and he had the only rig in the county that would move water in that cold. And a man does not stand warm in his own kitchen while his neighbors lose everything they have, if it is within his power to stop it. He could not have known what would come of it. No man could ever know such a thing, that a good act has a long memory all its own, that it sinks down into the bones of a place, and it waits there, patient in the dark for as long as it has to. That 28 years can roll by, and the man himself can grow old and die, and his farm can be sold off in lots, and his very name can begin to fall out of the mouth of the county that owed it everything. And then on one cold morning, a small girl in an oversized coat can come and sit down right in the middle of all of it and hold up a wooden paddle and a whole yard full of men who believed they were watching a child make a foolish mistake, can understand all at once and out loud that they are standing in the living presence of a debt far older than most of them, and that the hour to repay it has at long last and mercifully come. The men who laughed first were the men who did not know. The men who took off their hats were the men who did. And the whole of the difference between those two kinds of men was nothing more and nothing less than the difference between a place that remembers what it owes and a place that has let itself forget. Polk County remembered. On that cold November morning in 1947, in a foreclosure yard behind the fairgrounds, the county remembered everything all at once and out loud, and it stood up onto its feet, one man at a time with its hat held against its chest, and it let a 14-year-old girl settle in. A single hour an account that her grandfather had quietly opened 28 winters before, in the worst storm that anyone there had ever lived to see. That tractor still runs. Della Keller still farms her grandfather's land, and her daughter is coming home to it in the spring. And every January on the morning of the 16th, an old engine turns over in a shed in Iowa and settles down into the deep, slow heartbeat it has kept for more than half a century. And a woman drives it alone around the cold edge of a field in the gray light, and she listens the whole way around to the sound that once meant that someone was coming to help. Thank you for staying with this story all the way through to the end. If it moved you, if you have ever been the smallest and the quietest person in a room full of people who underestimated you, then leave a comment down below and tell me about it, because those are the comments I read first, and I read them all. Subscribe if you have not already, and I will see you in the next one.